Have you ever had the feeling that something isn't quite right? Maybe it's a shadow that moves when it shouldn't, or a sound you can't explain. What if I told you these moments, as fleeting as they might seem, could be the start of something far worse? Tonight I'm sharing 4 terrifying stories, each based on true events, that will make you question reality itself. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. Are you ready to confront the fear that lies just beneath the surface of everyday life? Let's dive into the darkness together. Story 1. The Whispering Woods. It started with a dare. My friends and I were camping near a secluded forest known as the Whispering Woods. Locals said the forest had a strange energy, with hikers frequently reporting disembodied whispers and feelings of being watched. Of course, we dismissed it as folklore. One night, after a few drinks around the campfire, someone suggested we venture into the woods. "Come on," my friend Jake said, grinning. "We'll prove there's nothing to be scared of." I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but peer pressure won out. Flashlights in hand, we trudged into the dense forest, laughter masking our unease. About 10 minutes in, the mood shifted. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over us. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. "Do you hear that?" Sarah, one of my friends, whispered. We froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a soft, whispering voice. It was indistinct, like someone mumbling just out of earshot. "It's probably the wind," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. As we pressed on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from all around us, impossible to pinpoint. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just off the trail. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Panic set in, and we turned back the way we'd come. But the forest seemed different, the paths unfamiliar. The whispers followed us, growing more insistent, more aggressive. Finally, we burst out of the woods, gasping for breath. When we reached the campsite, our gear was in shambles. Tents were slashed, and our belongings were scattered. To this day, I can still hear those whispers in my nightmares. Story 2. The Haunted Apartment. When I moved into my first apartment, I was ecstatic. It was small but cozy, and the rent was cheap. Too cheap in hindsight. From the first night, things felt off. The air was heavy, and there was a faint, unpleasant odor I couldn't locate. I chalked it up to the building's age and settled in. One evening, as I was unpacking, I heard a soft knock on the wall. I ignored it at first, but then it came again, louder. "Hello?" I called, thinking it might be a neighbor. No response. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and peeked outside. The hall was empty. Over the next few weeks, the activity escalated. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered, and I constantly felt like I was being watched. One night I saw it, a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and featureless, a shadow that seemed to absorb the light. Paralyzed with fear, I could only watch as it slowly leaned closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and losing my deposit. So I never went back. Story 3. The Phantom Hitchhiker. It was a foggy autumn night when I found myself on the long, desolate stretch of Highway 47. I'd stayed later than expected at a friend's house, reminiscing and losing track of time. The clock on my dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m., and the road ahead was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. As my headlights cut through the thick fog, I spotted her, a figure standing at the edge of the road, illuminated by the harsh white of my beams, a young woman, pale and fragile-looking, her thumb sticking out in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. She wore a tattered white dress, its hem dirty and torn, and her long dark hair hung limply around her face. For a moment I debated whether to stop. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to keep driving, but something about her seemed desperate, vulnerable. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked cautiously. Her head turned toward me slowly, and her dark eyes met mine. "Just a little further down the road," she said, her voice soft and melodic but somehow off. "All right," I muttered, unlocking the passenger door. She climbed in without hesitation, her movements fluid and almost unnatural. I noticed her bare feet as she settled into the seat. They were filthy, as though she'd been walking for miles. The silence between us was heavy as I pulled back onto the road. She stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her presence felt surreal, as if the air around her was colder than the rest of the car. "So, where exactly are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Just a little further," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at her, trying to gauge her age. She looked no older than 20. but something about her expression was unnerving. It was as though she were detached from reality, her eyes blank and unblinking. As we drove, I began to notice something strange. Whenever we passed under the sparse streetlights, she didn't cast a shadow. My heart began to race, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Do you live around here?" I asked, hoping for a mundane answer that would calm my nerves. She turned her head slowly to face me, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You should be careful on this road," she said. "A lot of accidents happen here." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of accidents?" I asked, my voice trembling, but she didn't respond. Instead, she continued to stare at me with that eerie smile. I felt the weight of her gaze, even as I kept my eyes fixed on the road. When I finally worked up the courage to glance back at her, she was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. My heart pounded as I whipped my head around, searching the empty car. The seatbelt was still fastened, but the passenger seat was completely empty. Panicked, I pulled over and jumped out of the car. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I checked the passenger side door. It was still locked from the inside. I even looked under the seat, though I knew it was pointless. She had vanished. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. Who or what had I just picked up? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more. I searched for information about Highway 47 and eventually came across an article about a fatal car accident that had occurred there 10 years earlier. A young woman had died after being struck by a car late at night. She'd been walking alone, wearing a white dress. The driver had fled the scene, and her case remained unsolved. The photo in the article sent shivers down my spine. It was her, the same woman I had picked up. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway at night. But sometimes, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for another ride. Story 4. The Cursed Family Heirloom, the Gift. When my grandmother passed away, she left each of her grandchildren a keepsake. Most of them were sentimental, old jewelry, trinkets, photo albums, but my gift was different. It was an antique mirror, its frame intricately carved with twisting vines and roses. The glass was slightly cloudy, as if it had seen centuries of use. This was one of her prized possessions, my mother explained as she handed it to me. She always said it was special. At first I was delighted. The mirror was beautiful, a piece of art that added a touch of elegance to my small apartment. I hung it in my bedroom, admiring how it reflected the soft glow of my bedside lamp. But from the moment it entered my home, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Reflections in the mirror seemed off. I'd catch glimpses of movement that didn't match what was happening in the room, a shadow passing behind me even when I was alone. At first I dismissed it as my imagination, but then, late one night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced at the mirror. My reflection was there, but something was wrong. I wasn't moving, but the image in the mirror was. My reflection smiled. I froze, unable to look away as the grin widened unnaturally, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. Then it spoke. "Get out!" I scrambled out of bed, yanking the sheet off the mirror and tossing it over the frame. For a moment, I thought that would be enough. But the next morning, I woke to find the sheet crumpled on the floor and the mirror hanging on the wall as if nothing had happened. Over the next few days, the disturbances grew more frequent. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. Lights flickered. Doors slammed shut, even when there was no breeze. One night I heard a faint whispering coming from the mirror. It was soft at first, like a distant conversation, but it grew louder until it was a cacophony of voices. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, chilling laugh. Desperate, I turned to my mother for answers. "Did Grandma ever say anything about the mirror?" I asked. She hesitated. She mentioned once that it came from an estate sale. The original owner had passed away under strange circumstances. I didn't need to hear any more. That night I decided to get rid of it. I took the mirror down, wrapped it in a blanket, and drove it to the nearest thrift store. As I carried it to the donation bin, I felt a strange resistance, as if the mirror didn't want to leave. When I returned home, the atmosphere in my apartment was lighter. The oppressive weight finally lifted. For weeks I slept soundly, convinced that I'd left the nightmare behind. But one evening, as I walked past an antique shop downtown, I froze. In the window, surrounded by other vintage items, was the mirror. It looked different, darker somehow, but I knew it was the same one. The reflection in the glass wasn't my own. Story 5. The Invitation. When the letter arrived, I thought it was a joke. It was written on thick, yellowed parchment, its edges slightly frayed. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, as though penned with a quill. "It is with great pleasure that I invite you to Blackthorn Manor for the weekend. Your presence is requested as the sole heir to a legacy far older than you might realize. The details of your inheritance will be discussed in person. Transportation will be arranged. Please be ready by sundown." The letter was signed simply A.R. Blackthorn. I didn't recognize the name, and I didn't have any known wealthy relatives. Yet something about the letter felt compelling. True to the letter's promise, a sleek black car arrived at my apartment just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The driver, an older man with a sharp suit and unreadable expression, didn't say a word as he opened the door for me. The journey was long, the landscape growing increasingly remote as we left the city behind. Dense woods flanked the narrow road, their skeletal branches clawing at the twilight sky. Finally, the car came to a stop in front of a sprawling estate. Blackthorn Manor was enormous, its Gothic architecture silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. Towers loomed high, their windows like dark, watchful eyes. "Welcome to Blackthorn Manor," the driver said, his voice gravelly and low. The first night, I was greeted at the door by a stern-looking woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper. Her expression was unreadable, her manner brisk. "You'll find everything you need in your room," she said, leading me up a grand staircase. "Dinner will be served in the dining hall at 8 sharp. My room was luxurious but unsettling. Heavy drapes covered the windows, and the furniture was antique, exuding an air of old money. A large, ornately framed mirror dominated one wall, and the bed's canopy seemed to sag under its own weight. As I unpacked, I noticed a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. I paused, heart pounding, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. At dinner, I was the only guest. The dining hall was cavernous, its long table set for one. Mrs. Graves served me a meal of roast chicken and vegetables, but the atmosphere was oppressive. "Is there anyone else here?" I asked, hoping for some company. "The staff and yourself," she replied curtly. I finished my meal quickly and retreated to my room, the silence of the manor pressing down on me like a weight. That night I woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The drapes rustled slightly, though the windows were firmly shut. My gaze shifted to the mirror and my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood in its reflection, partially obscured by shadow. It was tall and skeletal, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. But when I turned to look behind me, the room was empty. I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing. The figure didn't move but seemed to watch me with hollow, non-existent eyes. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. After all, I was in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by eerie silence. It wasn't unreasonable to feel unsettled, but as I explored the manor, it became clear that something was very wrong. The paintings on the walls seemed to follow me with their eyes, their expressions subtly shifting when I looked away. I found a library filled with dusty tomes, their spines cracked and faded. One book, however, looked newer than the rest. Its title read, my hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were filled with accounts of strange happenings, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and sightings of shadowy figures. One passage caught my attention. The heir to Blackthorn Manor is cursed to inherit its secrets, bound by blood to the darkness within its walls. Those who stay beyond the second night are never seen again. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. That evening I confronted Mrs. Graves. "What is this place?" I demanded. "Why was I brought here?" Her face remained expressionless, but her eyes were filled with something that looked like pity. "This is your inheritance," she said. "The manor chooses its heir, and now it has chosen you. There is no escape." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could press her further, she turned and walked away. That night the whispering returned, louder this time. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements unnatural and jerky. The mirror in my room seemed to hum with an ominous energy. Suddenly the door to my room creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, its face obscured by darkness. It beckoned to me with a skeletal hand, and against my will I found myself rising to follow. The figure led me down a series of twisting corridors, deeper into the manor than I'd thought possible. Finally, we reached a massive door carved with strange symbols. The figure gestured for me to open it. My hands shook as I pushed it open, revealing a cavernous chamber lit by an otherworldly glow. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating mass of shadow, its form shifting and writhing like a living thing. A voice echoed in my mind, deep and resonant. "Welcome, heir of Blackthorn. You are bound to us now. Memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. Visions of past heirs, their fates sealed by the same curse that now bound me. I saw them consumed by the darkness, their souls twisted into the shadows that now haunted the manor. Somehow I found the strength to run. I bolted back through the corridors, the whispering voices rising to a deafening crescendo. When I reached my room, I grabbed my belongings and fled. The front door, which had been locked the night before, swung open as I approached, as if the manor were allowing me to leave. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. To my relief, the car was still there, the driver waiting silently. "Take me home," I gasped, collapsing into the back seat. It's been months since I left Blackthorn Manor, but the memories still haunt me. Sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the whispering again, faint but unmistakable. I've tried to find out more about the manor, but it seems to have vanished from existence. No records, no maps, nothing. Whatever the manor is, it's still out there, waiting for its next heir. And I can only hope that person won't make the same mistake I did.